Y'all, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. As far as the Gita itself goes, if we were going to give a summary of what we've covered thus far, with a focus on brevity, with a focus on being really succinct, not like a single sentence, Arjuna had a crisis and Krishna began to help him. Not like that. But if we were focused on getting all the major points, but not getting caught up in the minutia of what we've covered so far, we might say something like this. Arjuna had a crisis, an existential crisis, a crisis of faith, because he was in a battle and he was going to have to face off against his family members. He started questioning what's life all about. He started questioning that, materialism wasn't going to make you happy, that there was something bigger going on with his family. He had doubts about what was pious and impious, what was right and wrong, what was his duty. And he surrendered to Krishna, who then told him that you're not the body, that there's a basic difference between spirit and matter. He also told him that armed with this knowledge, you should do your duty, but be detached from the results. That philosophy that you're not the body is called Sankhya or Jnana. That following, that behavioral modification is called yoga, or karma yoga, or buddhi yoga. When you realize you're not the body, when you realize you're a spiritual being, and then you go back into the world armed with that wisdom, and you do your duty without being attached, that's called yoga. Arjuna wanted to know something about that yogi and how they, practically speaking, lived in this world without becoming too enmeshed in it. At the end of this discussion, Arjuna was bewildered. He still couldn't wrap his head around how you could take a wisdom tradition and a tradition of activism and merge them together. Because those two schools of thought in ancient India and all over the world are generally at odds. So he essentially asked his same question again, as if he hadn't really understood Krishna. And Krishna then was able to weigh in strongly on the side of activism and cultivating spirituality through activism, starting by acting, starting by doing your duty, even if it's materially motivated and you haven't fully understood you're not the body, still start. And by regulating yourself and acting in accordance with a set of virtues or values that are bigger than you and not just based on your whimsy, that then connects you to a higher truth, which will eventually help you realize that you're not the body, that you don't have anything to do with this world, and that's where we are now. Krishna then finished with the last verse we read last week, which was text 17 of chapter 3. He finished strong. But for one who takes pleasure in the self, whose human life is one of self-realization, and who is satisfied in the self only, fully satiated, for him there's no duty. Two, but is generally, it is a contrasting conjunction. It takes the first half of your statement and in a lot of ways goes against it and subverts it. I was going to go to the store, but they were closed because of the coronavirus. Hence, I didn't go. You follow? In Sanskrit, but is tu. Tu ya atmarati. Ya tu atmarati. But one who, yaha means one who. One who is atmarati. Atmarati. Atma, in addition to meaning soul, body, mind, depending on its context, it also means oneself. Atma means oneself. Are we good? He's saying we're good. How come he's like 3 steps ahead of you? Oh, it's your phone. Okay. Were we good the whole time?
Yeah, we were good. It just asked for time limit.
All right. I'm going to sally forth. Atmarati means sexual pleasure in Sanskrit. And the words used in philosophical literature to really communicate when somebody, it also means attachment, but it's used in the philosophical literature to really indicate that spiritual pleasure is lacking nothing. You know, sometimes we'll use like the word ecstasy, or sometimes people say ecstasy because it's not external, it's within you, so ecstasy. Sometimes we'll use, I was ecstatic. We'll use that kind of language, which sometimes for people who are not like, when I was distributing books in Japan, I had to learn not to use the word ecstatic because it was used almost exclusively to mean sexual pleasure. And so we had to not use the word ecstatic. I can't remember what it was. But it was like, I learned the Japanese word for ecstatic, but something like, no, don't use that. It exclusively means carnal pleasure. Even more so than it does in English. But sometimes in a language, if you really want to sink the point home, you know, you'll use that. I was madly in love with that idea. I was head over heels for that idea. You follow? You'll use that romantic, sexually charged language about something spiritual or philosophical to demonstrate conclusively to the people you're talking to just how important the idea is to you. It's a bit sensationalist, but it has a long history. Atmarati means attached to the self, enjoying in the self. But like I said, the word has a carnal denotation, really, in Sanskrit. The dictionary definition is romantic. Yatu, atmarati, but one who finds satisfaction in the self. They find their pleasure in the self. Yes, tu atmarati eva syat, but one who is able to find their satisfaction in the self. Atma tripta chamanava. And a person who finds atma tripta, who finds satisfaction in the self too. So they enjoy within the self, they're satisfied within the self. Tripta communicates satisfaction, pleasure, but from the point of view of being satisfied. Atmani eva cha santushta. Santushta means satisfied too. Atmani, in the self, santushta, satisfied in the self. So you're atma tripta, atma santushta, and you're also atmarati. Enjoying in the self. I'm having a hard time differentiating between tripta and santushta. Maybe nourished by the self, satisfied by the self, that might work. For him, tasya kayam na vidite. For him, there's no duty to be found. This is nice because it indicates that although Krishna is really pushing this agenda of doing your duty, he's not doing so to a fault. He does understand that you can become so transcendental that you really go beyond this world. If God has to follow the law, then there's no such thing as mercy. Mercy consists of subverting the law for a higher purpose. You follow? If God follows the law, there's no love. Because fairness and law and justice are different than love, which by its very definition indicates a personal touch, some feeling behind it. And so it's a tightrope walk between justice and mercy, between duty and transcendence. You don't want to make duty so powerful that there's absolutely nothing beyond it. Just like if God loves that which is good, then goodness becomes God because it's above God, because it existed before God, and it also exists independently of God. If God loves that which is good, its goodness is independent of God, and therefore it exists separately from God. When you start to beat the drum that it's all about duty and there's nothing beyond duty, then duty becomes God. Justice becomes God, karma becomes God, and there's no need for a God. There's no need for a lawmaker because the law itself is supreme. The moment you introduce a lawmaker, you introduce the possibility of clemency, you introduce the possibility of mercy, of being pardoned, etc. So, although Krishna beats the drum of duty throughout the entire Gita, every so often he'll throw in a verse like this to remind us that we're ultimately having a spiritual conversation about the soul which transcends the body by its very constituency. Now that can lead to antinomianism, which means that you can do anything. And sometimes you see the spiritualists will say, because I'm self-realized, I can get away with anything. That becomes a problem. But then if you're like, everybody's the same and everybody like follows the same rules and no one ever beats the game. Like, you're always an alcoholic. You'll always be an alcoholic. You'll never be free from that alcoholism. You'll never transcend it. And you got to go to AA meetings every day for the rest of your life, forever and ever. Amen. It becomes problematic. So a verse like this, it complicates things. Things aren't as black and white anymore. They're not as easy. But you ultimately end up with a much deeper version of spirituality. It's just a little more difficult to balance. We like easy things, but real things are often not simple or easy. You know? They take some nuance. You got to navigate them. Prabhupada's translation. But one who takes pleasure in the self, that's the Atmarati, whose human life is one of self-realization, that's the Atmatripta, and who is thus satisfied in the self only, that's Atmasantushta. For him, there's no duty. So you see, that's what you got to do. You don't want to make them all synonyms. Although sometimes using words that are synonyms has value. You got to love them, care for them, nourish them. A statement like that has meaning. It has meaning to some extent because the repetitiveness of similar terms communicates how important this is. That you're finding everything from within. That you've really won the race. That you're no longer looking outside yourself for enjoyment. You find your satisfaction, your pleasure, your nourishment, your happiness, your joy, your peace from within. A self-realized person has no purpose to fulfill in the discharge of his prescribed duties, nor has he any reason not to perform such work, nor has he any need to depend on any other living being. You really transcend this world. We have to understand something. I'm going to give you guys a little history lesson here. There was a Vedic culture that flourished. They followed a body of Sanskrit texts called the Vedas. These people were Vedic. They are also called Aryans. Those Vedas were then interpreted. One of the main schools, one of the earliest schools to interpret the Vedas was the Mimamsakas, the examiners. They were the first hermeneutes. They developed the first systematic theory of how to analyze a text that existed in the world. That the last statement supersedes the earlier statement. That a statement which is repeated many times supersedes a statement which is only made one time. That at the beginning of a book, you should look because the author will oftentimes tell you what the subject is about. That the conclusion of the book represents the final thoughts of the author. That, differences between imperative statements, you must do this, and optative statements, you could do this, and the different weight that should be given to those statements. Rules of interpretation, that when you say time flies, a literal reading of that doesn't work, and so therefore you are allowed to interpret that somewhat metaphorically. And that's reasonable in language. When you don't have to interpret something metaphorically, you should take the literal meaning of a text. Text should primarily be understood by their literal meaning, and only when that fails are you allowed to engage in more metaphorical readings of a text. Stuff like that. For that group of people, they came up with a famous statement, Atato Dharma Jigyasu. Right now, inquire about Dharma. In their sutras, in their texts that they wrote codifying the beliefs of their school. Have I lost you guys yet? All right. So, those Mimamsakas, they said that the rules of the Vedas are the most important thing that exists, that if God exists, it doesn't matter because God has to follow the rules of the Vedas. The Vedas effectively are God. The rules of the Vedas represent the law and order of mankind. The rules of the Vedas must be followed. They are aparushaya, not created by man. They're nitya, they're eternal. And even though they may appear at a certain time and place, they represent the wind of the spiritual world coming into this world, and they connect us to something higher than ourselves. You saw Krishna endorsing that when he said that these things are born of doing your duty, and your duty is articulated in the Vedas, and therefore, and the Vedas come from Brahman, and therefore when you do your duty, you're ultimately connecting to Brahman. He just made this kind of an argument, a real hardcore ritual argument that the ritual is the most important thing. Within the Vedas, there were these funky groups of people. And their movement is loosely referred to as the Shraman movement. These people were the yatis, the renunciates, those people who had gone beyond. They were the sannyasis. Sannyasis are oftentimes referred to as yatis. They've gone beyond. They were the shramans, like people who endeavored really intensely for self-realization. They were the Kaishans, long-haired. They didn't shave their heads. They wore their head in a jata. They wore their head in a dreadlock. They were the Digambars. They were clothed in the directions. They walked around naked. These people existed in the time of the Veda. How do we know? Because they're mentioned in the Veda. But they didn't live within the Vedic culture. They had transcended the Vedic culture. And they lived by their own set of rules. And they didn't perform yajna like their life was a yajna. And they didn't perform yajna the way that the upstanding members of society that made up the Vedic culture performed yajna. These schools formed Buddhism, really. The Jain movement, and also so many of our ascetic orders, they are the children and grandchildren of these schools of individuals that existed on the periphery of Vedic culture. They were recognized by the Vedic culture, but they didn't follow the same set of rules. They moved to the beat of a different drum. They followed a higher standard and a higher calling. What you see here is Krishna is actually honoring both schools. He beats the drum of the Vedic school that you should follow the rules, but he doesn't do so to such an extent that he doesn't acknowledge the possibility of transcendence. You could imagine if you were at a college class and there was a certain thing you had to do in that class, and there was a certain body of literature that you had to study, and there were certain questions that had to be asked, and this had all been written down and put together as a curriculum. And then, let's say you were taking a physics class, and then Albert Einstein decided he wanted to teach at CSULB. He decided he wanted to sit in and be an adjunct professor and teach a beginning physics class. Right? You get it? And he goes, let's not worry about that textbook. I'm just going to talk, and I just want you guys to listen. Put your pens down. Put your computers down. Put your textbooks down. We're not going to use the textbooks this semester. I have a different idea of what we're going to do. it would be okay because of who he is. There'd be one or two punctilious people in the class, pedants in the class, and they would be disturbed that the curriculum was being broken. And those people would just have to drop out or get over themselves. Because anybody with half a brain would be able to understand that this was magic. That's got to be there. It's got to be governed to some extent so that people who have that magic have some set of criteria and you judge them by. Set of criteria that you judge them by. For instance, the Caitians were naked. They had long wild hair. They lived by begging. They had a very saintly lifestyle. You could recognize them. You could recognize them. Their duties were outside of the scope of what the Veda recommended, but they weren't outside the scope of reason. They weren't outside the scope of responsibility. They just had a different set of responsibilities. Their renunciation, their celibacy, their lack of materialism, their sobriety, their asceticism demonstrated a certain level of advancement that exempted them from some of the lower rules. Now it's not just rules for rules' sake. We haven't lost the spirit of the law because of the letter of the law. This balancing act between justice and mercy, between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, between, systematizing something and becoming pedantic. That balance, we know about this. We have words to describe people. They're too much like rule followers. They're sheeple. We have words for this. We have words for describing people that go rogue and are foolhardy. We have words for describing when people go either too far on either side. That same thing went on with the Vedas. Krishna here is walking that tightrope. He might seem like he is subverting everything he said, but he's not. He's just keeping that torch of transcendence burning so we don't become merely ritual. Ritualistic is when ritual is at the cost of philosophy, is at the cost of emotion, is at the cost of depth. Then we call such a thing ritualistic. It's a bad word. It has a negative connotation. When you say that it's ritualistic, it's a criticism. It's gone too far. Krishna's balancing that here. Now, it kind of leaves you thinking, well, so what? Is like once you get to that stage, you just can do anything you want to do? Therefore, without being attached to the fruits of activities, one should act as a matter of duty, for by working without attachment, one attains the supreme. All right, so for the lower guys, they should act so they can get to this place where they attain the supreme, and when you attain the supreme, then you don't have to do your duty anymore necessarily, right? But you have to at least go through that course of doing your duty to get there. All right, we're still left with that question though, like, well, if I've attained the supreme, or if somebody thinks they can just like do anything? Kings such as Janak attain perfection solely by performance of prescribed duties. Therefore, just for the sake of educating the people in general, you should perform your work. We should break this sentence down into two parts. The first part is the finish of his previous thought. You should do your duty because even great personalities who achieve perfection, they got so by doing their work. Janak, by the way, is the father of Janaki, Sita. And so he was a contemporary in that time. Very famous king, Janak Maharaj. Famous Vedic king who's famous for doing his duty. So Krishna quotes Janak and says Janak did his duty and attained perfection. Therefore, you should do your duty to achieve perfection. And once you achieve perfection, then maybe you can give up your duty. But don't give it up until then. Right? That completes the thought, but it still leaves you with that question. Well, if I've achieved perfection, then I don't have to do my duty anymore? And then the second half of the verse comes in. Therefore, just for the sake of educating the people in general, you should perform your work. That's different. To educate other people and set a proper example is a reason for even someone who's achieved perfection to still do their duty. It's a spiritual philanthropy. As such, it augments or adjusts or modifies the previous statement that there's no duty to perform except for to educate other people. Therefore, there's no duty that you have to perform for yourself because your life has become a... By the way, the resolution to the problem is this. Just like God doesn't love things which are good, things are good because they resemble God. And therefore God appreciates those things which resemble himself. And God is the supreme personified goodness. Therefore goodness needn't be seen as separate from or different than God. Similarly, the self-realized soul naturally follows the rules. That self-realized soul may break small rules, unimportant rules, secondary rules. But it's the nature of a saintly person that they'll never break the big rules because it's just not in their bones. So it's not that you can't look at the behavior of a saintly person and examine their behavior. And they're completely beyond any sort of testing. You find that they follow the rules naturally. They're naturally pious. They're naturally devoted. They turn towards Krishna naturally. It's just who they are. It's not an act. It's who they are. And so, in the same way that Krishna loves things that are good because they are like himself, and therefore goodness is not separate from God, similarly, saintly people love piety. It's just who they are. And therefore they naturally behave piously. They may drop some basic duties, like maybe fighting in a war or something like that, but they're not going to drop their morality, which is part of their fundamental nature. And they'll follow duty to teach other people. And even by not following all the small rules, they still teach. They teach the difference between the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. And they set an example that there is something that goes beyond the rules. As such, even in their transcendence of the rules, they still teach us the value and the limitations of rules. That would be a resolution of the paradox. to the contradiction. And Krishna himself is clearly not giving his last word, because the next verse says, oh, but that's an example for the people. And that philanthropic angle is a game changer, because that means even when you have achieved perfection, you still have to be concerned about setting a good example for others. Whatever action a great man performs, common men follow. And whatever standards he sets by exemplary acts, all the world pursues. So Krishna gives a little, almost like a decree. It's a decree. Krishna's supporting his argument by offering a decree. You know? It's almost like Platonic or Shakespearean or Socratic. It could be written like, on the walls of the Oracle at Delphi or something like that, right? It's like, whatever actions a great man performs. You know what? That verse is carved into the walls of the palace of the king of Thailand. Thailand has this whole Vedic culture thing going on. So does Indonesia. But Thailand's even more so because it's really close. So they're Buddhists, but they're not really Buddhists. They're kind of like Buddhists, but they got a whole Vedic, Sanskrit, Hanuman, Garuda thing going on. And that verse is in the palace of the king, along with a bunch of other verses from the Gita. Whatever action a great man performs, common men follow, and whatever standards he sets by exemplary acts, all the world pursues. There is no work prescribed for me within all the three planetary systems, nor am I in want of anything, nor have I a need to obtain anything, and yet I'm engaged in prescribed duties. Now, Krishna is God. It's already been apparent when Krishna said, Yukta asita matpara, in the last chapter, sit in yoga, think with me as the highest object. He's already given a little bit of foreshadowing. But in the next chapter, at the beginning of the chapter, he straight up says, I'm God. A triple omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient deity. A classical conception of God. It's interesting, but God here is saying that he himself has to behave in a normative way to set appropriate standards. Of course, what to speak of everybody else, if it even extends to Krishna. Now, this must be hyperbole. But not really, because the resolution to that Euthyphro dilemma is that God is the personification of goodness. Therefore, real goodness exists. That is God. And God wouldn't do anything wrong or evil because it's not his nature, because his nature is that he is the personification of goodness. Goodness in its ultimate iteration exists as a person. And the abstract quality of goodness is just something out there which resembles its origin, which is the original good person, which is the source of everything which exists. Amazingly, that personality still has mores and values they have to espouse. So it's almost like it's got to be hyperbole. But Krishna doesn't stop here. For if I ever failed to engage in carefully performing prescribed duties, certainly all men would follow my path. If I did not perform prescribed duties, all these worlds would be put to ruination. I would be the cause of creating unwanted population, and I would thereby destroy the peace of all living beings. So Krishna has now doubled and tripled down on his initial statement that God cannot do any damn thing. Not necessarily because Krishna would get bad karma. He doesn't mention he would get bad karma or a reaction. But he has a responsibility to his children. And all good God would have a sense of responsibility to his children. And all powerful God would be able to act in accord with that at all times. Despite the fact that we're saying the Supreme Being has a duty, which means there's something above him, not really. He has a duty to act according to his own nature, lest he sets a bad example for others. But we could interpret this as being hyperbolic in the sense that naturally Krishna will always act in accord with his own nature, which is for our best interest. And for the purpose of pointing out to Arjuna that you really can't get out of this, he uses himself as an example, which would mean that Arjuna also has to always do his duty to set a proper example. And we could reconcile that with the Shramans, that their duty is to set an example of when to retire. That the Shramans' duty, that the Kaishans' duty, that the Yatis' duty, that the Sannyasi's duty, that the renunciate's duty is to set an example of when to retire from this world. You follow? And so in that sense, they're still doing their duties. They're still part of the Vedic culture. They're the crown jewel of the Vedic culture, setting an example of ultimate transcendence that's required for all people who will eventually have to give up, what to speak of their caste, they'll have to give up their own body and their mind and go beyond this world. So any tradition that doesn't include that is seriously lacking a core item. Did you guys follow that? I'm just going to say it again because I wasn't sure I made sense. I'm pretty sure I made sense, but I hate to ever jump forward when I feel like I've left a little something dangling for someone to get confused on. So as painful as it is for me to have to make sure I don't make a mistake, I'm just going to say the whole thing again 3 times fast because it's good for me. Krishna beats the drum of the Vedic culture and its attachment to duty. He then points out that there is a stage where you go beyond duty. That is critical for a spiritual tradition that's teaching that you're the soul and not the body, because you're going to have to eventually give up your body. And so that conception of transcendence must be there. Otherwise, duty becomes God, and God loses, and mercy and love die an ignoble death. So Krishna walks that tightrope between these two value systems and holds these two things in tension. And he tells Arjuna, okay, so you want to get to that higher stage, you got to do your duty. Actually, even when you're in that higher stage, you'll still do your duty. Why? To set an example for others. And that's independent of what stage you're at. That's a higher reason. He then issues a decree, and then he says that he himself has the same situation. Now, at a glance, that would appear that duty was above God. But it's not if you understand that duty is part of God's nature, and therefore also acting saintly is part of the saint's nature. And although they might drop some small rules, they never drop the big rules, because it's their nature. And now the person and the value becomes one. And instead of seeing the world as abstract values and abstract goodness, and then God has to live up to that, or people have to live up to that, we can rather see that these values and this goodness inheres naturally within the personality of a saint, within the personality of the deity. And so even if Krishna is being a little bit hyperbolic in this section, he doesn't stray too far, because he doesn't say he'd get bad karma or something ridiculous like that, being God. But he does say he'd be guilty of misleading us, and that's true. If God did not set a proper example, if God did not love us, if God did not set up a proper system of universal management that had justice and mercy in perfect balance, we wouldn't have a good north light. We wouldn't have a guiding principle. And so Krishna, as a loving deity, has done that and feels responsible for us the same way a parent feels responsible to their children. Because he's a singularity, there's a limit to how far that analogy of parenthood goes. but it's useful, at least for a time. All right, I think I made my point. I think I did it right that time. I think I did it right last time, but I think it flowed a little better that time. Okay. All right. And the purport of this is, there's no way to get out of doing your duty, Arjuna. Right? That's the purport of it. As the ignorant perform their duties with attachment to results, the learned may similarly act, but without attachment. See that? That's the distinction. Which, of course, now ties it back together with the do your duty but don't be attached. See how Krishna expertly did that? He took us on a whole trajectory into Vedic ritual, into attachment, into setting an example for others, into transcending. Stuff we haven't really covered in the second chapter. And then brought us all the way back to the learned person acts without attachment. Just like the ignorant act and do their duty but with attachment, the learned person acts without attachment, for the sake of leading people on the right path, so that they will eventually learn to also act without attachment. So as not to disrupt the minds of ignorant men attached to fruitive results of prescribed duties, a learned person should not induce them to stop work. Rather, by working with a spirit of devotion, he should engage them in all sorts of activities for the gradual development of Krishna consciousness. Let's look at the Sanskrit. Okay? Na janayet. He should not cause. Buddhi bedham. The breaking of the intelligence. Agyanam, of the ignorant. Karma sanginam, of those who are attached. So the learned person should not cause ignorant, attached people to lose their minds. Joshayat sarvakarmani vidvan yukta samacharan. He should join together all works. That learned person should live and unite all work, kind of under this banner of self-realization. He should act without attachment from the previous verse. He should then bring people in to show them how to act with attachment, but he's setting an example of how to act without attachment. Those people then learn, and he kind of brings it all together and wraps it all up with a bow tie. Does that make sense? He should engage everything properly so that it leads to this goal. And not just disturb people by preaching a higher standard that people can't wrap their heads around. Does that make sense?
Isn't that
loud?
That's like what Krishna just did. He started with a higher standard. Arjuna didn't get it. He was bewildered, and he lowered to start from a lower platform to explain
Yes,
the whole thing.
Krishna is the perfect example of this. Krishna gave Arjuna instruction. Arjuna became bewildered. Krishna then dumbed down his instruction for Arjuna, told him about ritual, and then came back around to teaching him the higher principle and brought Arjuna up to speed by pacing him where he was at. Therefore, Krishna is the perfect example of this, and we should follow suit. And we should engage people. He should engage all kinds of acts and unite them instead of saying this is good, this is bad, you guys are left out. And a classic example of this, which is oftentimes given, is that Prabhupada used to like to give this example. To fully flesh it out would probably be a little more complicated. Prabhupada's example is extremely simple. But the Vedas allow people to eat meat. They say you need to perform a sacrifice if you want to eat meat. But the sacrifice has so many rules and regulations attached, including the rule that you have to tell the animal, I'm going to kill you, but you're going to come back and kill me. That there's no way to perform the sacrifice without becoming thoughtful and realizing that you shouldn't be performing the sacrifice. You can also drink alcohol if you want to, but the process of making the alcohol and offering it in sacrifice is so unbelievably complicated and cumbersome that, you're over it and you realize that this stuff is all temporary and it's not what life is about. And so rather than telling people you can't do this and just giving people a series of rules and regulations that they can't follow, you got to get in the mix and help people to regulate themselves in a way that they can live with, in a way that's going to lead them to a higher path, instead of making a hard line and saying you can't come. For example, people come to the Hare Krishna temple, like she came to the Hare Krishna temple, and I was talking to her one day at the temple, and she's like, oh, I'm going to go to I'm hungry again, I'm going to go to In-N-Out afterwards. In-N-Out hamburgers. So she came to the temple, and she said, I'm hungry, or maybe she just came from In-N-Out. She goes, no, I'm not hungry, I don't need prasadam, I just had a big meal at In-N-Out. Which of course just made me want to vomit all over her. But I didn't. And now she's initiated and doesn't do such things anymore. But if I'd freaked out initially at the outset and made a huge stink, that would have been it. I had to roll with it a little bit. And, take a more gradual approach. We're being told to do that. Have a high standard ourselves. It's like justice for me, mercy for others. Most people want justice for others, mercy for me. At least you can be consistent. Justice for me, justice for others, mercy for me, mercy for others. But even better, hey, mercy for everybody else, justice for me. I'll take the hit, you shouldn't have to. One very senior devotee, who I have a lot of respect for, he made some mistake. Fairly significant mistake. And his wings were clipped for a couple years. He wasn't allowed to give classes, wasn't allowed to minister to anybody, wasn't allowed to guide anybody, and had to just do his own thing. Anyway, I met with him afterwards, and I didn't know anything about it. Somehow or other, I didn't hear about it. So he's a saintly person. I went up and offered my obeisances to him like I always did. He said, yeah, I just got done being in trouble. And I said, oh, for what? And he goes, oh, you didn't hear? And he told me what he'd done, told me what he got in trouble for. And I said, well, what are you doing? He goes, oh, I'm gonna go lobby now to change the rules. He says, I don't think it's right that when somebody has difficulty, they're stopped from doing outreach, because the outreach is therapeutic. So he said, but I didn't want to seem like it was self-interested. So I took my punishment without saying anything, and now that my punishment is over again, I want to make a big deal about this so the next person doesn't have to suffer like I did. Did you guys follow that? I'm not going to mention the Vaishnava's name nor what he did. It's unimportant. It's a very, very great soul. But the point he made was that he didn't complain or protest when he was under the knife. But after it was done and he was allowed to be free, then he went and made a big hue and cry and made a bunch of noise about us changing our protocols because he didn't want somebody else to suffer like he had. Justice for myself, mercy for others. And so devotees, generally speaking, try to follow nicely to set an example for others. And they also don't expect others to necessarily follow like they do. It's great when people do. We want everybody to come up to the right standard. But we don't necessarily expect everybody to be able to, and definitely don't expect them to be able to right away. The advice Krishna is giving is extremely practical. It's the way serious religious movements run. And Krishna makes a brilliant argument. Even if you've got perfection, you still have to set an example. Even an all good and all loving and all powerful God has to set things up nicely. What to speak of all of us who have to play our roles. You don't be attached, but do your duty. And that way you'll pace people and they can catch up with you. Don't confuse them too much. Don't say stuff they can't follow. Slow it down for them so they can jump on the train and then speed up. How many minutes are we in?
About 10 more minutes.
I'm feeling good. I feel like we hit a natural break point. We hit a natural break point. Comments? Discussion? Loud.
So, you were saying that a saintly person, they just kind of naturally live a pious life.
Dave, give me a thumbs up. Darshan, give me a thumbs up if you can hear him. Can you hear him? All right, go loud.
Because it becomes a part of their nature. So then, if you're kind of considering that, the trajectory you're on, and if you're making progress, and you see, okay, it's easier and easier for me to live a pious life and to have desire to do these types of things.
That's a very good sign. When you examine your own life and you see that you want to commit sinful acts less, that's a great sign that you're making advancement. In contrast, if you find you are increasingly lusty and angry and greedy, you're doing something wrong. Because Krishna consciousness works. And when you do it right, it works. Sometimes somebody say to me, I've been chanting for many years, but I'm not having any realizations. I'm like, no, you haven't. Maybe you've been mumbling for years. Schnick, schnick, wobble, wobble, or something like that. But you haven't been chanting Hare Krishna for years. It doesn't work like that. We have a process. It works. It legitimately works. Every time, for everybody. Doesn't mean we're the only way. Maybe there's a better way out there. Maybe the Jews or the Christians got it better than we did. I'm not trying to make that point. But our process works. If you take association devotees, if you manage not to make offenses, if you do some service, if you express your doubts, if you wear your heart on your sleeve, if you chant your rounds sincerely, if you follow the principles, magic will happen in your life again and again and again. Every year will be more special than the year before. You will grow by leaps and bounds. Nothing will knock you down permanently. You'll come back stronger every single time. KC works. And so if you're feeling happier and more internally satisfied and less lusty, or even if you are lusty, you're less attached to your lust, you feel less compelled to act on it, you see a bigger picture, these are very good signs. In contrast, when you become materialistic and narrow-minded and petty and deceitful and duplicit, then you're definitely doing something wrong. For sure. You start thinking they're all whack. That's another one. We start thinking those devotees are all whack. I know better. I'm not so into this. What are you cutting off?